Good afternoon, Dr. Hisham. It's good to see you. Can you hear us? Can you
Hello.
Hi. Can you please start sharing your screen?
Of course.
Okay, let's make a very quick introduction, and you go ahead and start. Okay. Dear participants of Central Temple, thanks for participating in our online session. And we thank our previous speaker, Greg, for a wonderful speech about public speaking. Now, we would like to use the Professor Saghbani, our colleague from Cambridge Second English, who will talk about learner-oriented assessment, with particular focus on linguistic reasons. So, Professor, you can go ahead and start.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. Thank you for the nice introduction. This is not the first time I take part in this conference, but it is always a pleasure to talk to you, and hopefully I'll be adding something interesting and useful that you can apply in your classes. So yeah, my name is Dr. Hisham Saghbani, and I'm going to be taking you through the coming few minutes really to explore theme and approach. I think we talked about briefly last year in last year's edition, but this time we will assess basically how far we went in the implementation of learning-oriented assessment, and the impact of this approach on learners' achievement and the tool that basically we used in that quest. In this presentation, I'll basically be dividing into three parts. The first part is looking at the concept, the overall rationale behind establishing a new approach to the use of assessment in the classroom. And the second part will look at the implementations, and the final part will look at the tools used. So obviously, hopefully there will be some time at the end to answer your questions. I will share my contact details. So if you basically don't feel that your question is answered, please feel free to get in touch, and I'll be more than happy to reply. So without further ado, let me just give you some background to where the concepts come from. So learning-oriented assessment is not, technically a new approach. It's not a new theme. What's new about learning-oriented assessment is the implementation and the mechanisms and really the advanced technology that's just, moving forward very, very quickly in the direction of coming up with new tools and new mechanisms. And the aim, the ultimate aim for all of this is to create a more relevant content to our English language users. Of course, COVID helped a lot in expanding and expediting the process of that transformation within the learning practice that we're calling for. I always say that the work that was supposed to be done in 10 years was done in 2 years, at least from our end, in terms of the technology and the right tools to be incorporated. So what is really the whole theme, and what does it refer to? We're starting from one base, which is really making learning more effective. So the ultimate quest that basically we are hoping to achieve through the implementation of learning-oriented assessment is making learning more effective. And making learning more effective requires some theoretical backgrounds, really. And I will use a number of theories here just to explain my point, and then we will move to the implementation in a minute. But the ultimate, agreement across all disciplines in education that the more involved we are in learning, the more effective it becomes. This is a very interesting notion. It's a very interesting theory that was studied thoroughly, that was analyzed over the years. And one of the probably most common theories in this is Dale's pyramid of learning. where the actual effectiveness of education is measured by remembrance, how much we remember after completing a specific course. And obviously the relevance here is in the application. Are we able to apply the things that we learn in the classroom practically? Are we able to really use these tools and these ideas and these concepts that we develop in class in a practical context? That's really the big question here. So the whole theme is around promoting that concept. How can we make sure that whatever we do in the classroom is more relevant? So the theoretical base to this, and obviously this is now becoming a trend in education, that the more involved, as I said, we are in the learning process, the more effective the whole learning journey becomes. And the highest level of involvement, according to this diagram, is represented in a form of participation, actual physical participation in activity. Being physically involved in an exercise or a task, collecting data, summarizing results, producing an end product is typically what involvement refers to in this quest. But the question that poses itself here is, how can we do this in an online context? Many countries around the world are still aiming for more of a hybrid model to learning, whereby delivery is not always physical. We're still witnessing many cases where learning is online. And in fact, in many countries, this is seen as something that that's here to stay. I know I work with very different institutions in different countries, and the trend that I'm feeling is that the concept of hybrid learning, combination of online versus face-to-face learning, is here to stay, and that probably proven very successful to a certain extent in various scenarios and various cases, and ultimately it's helping both institutions and learners. But how can we make sure that the concept of effectiveness of learning that we're calling for is actually kind of falling within that kind of context? So we obviously had to go back to the basis. We have to analyze classrooms and how the character of the classroom plays a role in measuring that kind of effectiveness. And for that, I will use Kolb's theory or Kolb's definition of learning, which is the transformation of our own experiences. So that all falls within the same theme, within the same concept. And that's technically the fact that if we are taking part in exercise, then obviously we will end up, kind of remembering or increasing the level of involvement, and according to Dale, increasing effectiveness of learning. The connection here is that probably one of the key things that we can get learners involved in is assessment. So this approach then aims to one thing, which is transforming the use of assessment into something practical that can be applied in a learning context. We'll see in a minute that basically traditionally assessments are used, well, whether they are for learning or assessments of learning, it doesn't matter, but they happen as a result of something else. They take place as a result of another exercise. I do an assessment after I finish explaining what the topic is, typically, whether it's a formative assessment that takes place within the classroom or a summative one that takes place at the end of the course. Both of them happen as at the end of our process. The unique difference in this approach that we're calling for is a new utilization of assessment that happens at the start of that learning journey, not at the end. With that idea in mind, please keep it in mind for a few minutes. We will just assess a few scenarios and we'll come back to it with more details. But the underpinning concept that I'm calling for here is, how can we shift our traditional assessments into something that can be used effectively as a learning tool And to me, this is really something worth exploring further. And I've been personally working with various institutions in different countries to measure the effectiveness of that approach in reality. And I'm more than happy to apply that concept in any of your scenarios. If you are just reach out to me, and I'll be more than happy to work with you on this. I'll probably developing some sort of a research base whereby we can measure the effectiveness of that model, or the impact rather of that model on your learner's achievement. So, as I said, the theoretical background is increasing the involvement of the learner. That's really the underpinning thought there, and that's aiming for a more effective creation of experiences that would result in more effective learning. In order to achieve that increase in effectiveness, we have to understand various theoretical concepts. So one of them is called exponential learning theory. I love this model because really it summarizes the work we've been doing for the past few months, for the past few years, really, which is measuring two things: learning at one end, and what goes into learning, whatever that mechanism is, whether it's a learning tool, a new piece of technology, or in this context now, an assessment. In order for that to work, we have to develop some more reflective observation mechanisms. And when in reflective observation mechanisms, we refer to the mechanism whereby the role of the teacher transforms from being somebody that will pass knowledge to somebody that will facilitate the creation of knowledge. And I go back to the definition that I just started with here a few minutes back, that the definition of knowledge in Kolb's theory is the transformation of our own experiences. That means technically the role of the teacher now has shifted to supporting learners' transformation of experiences into something they remember. So it's that facilitation role that kind of plays a major part in creating a more effective learning mechanism. I mean, if you're thinking of this concept and these different ideas for a while, you'll realize with me that ultimately this is not much easier said than done. There are lots of challenges that we face in applying this. One of the key challenges is how can we make sure that we are recording our observations? And how can we ensure that the assessment tool that basically we have in our hands is going to be used effectively as a learning tool? And for that, we will explore some concepts. From last year's discussions and my paper that I presented last year, I summarized 3 characteristics for effectiveness of learning. The first one is engagement. To create a more engaged rapport in the classroom using that assessment mechanism. And then the second one is creating a more motivating environment. Motivation is fundamental for active learning. And the third one is thinking. So we've got 3 main important variables. These are the 3 variables that we hope would exist in the LOA cycle: engagement, motivation, and thinking. Let me just give an overview for each one of them. Engagement, of course, making sure that I support learners' autonomy and promoting discovery models of learning. So in this context, I want to create a more engaging structure. That's what I said at the beginning, that in many cases, in many scenarios, we tend to remember teachers or certain classes that we took when we were studying at university or in school, just simply because there was a unique characteristic or a unique character of that class, whether it's the teacher, whether it's the charisma of the teacher, or the technology used, whatever it is, that there is always that kind of connection that will engage us with learning. And this could be also in a modern way, the gamification of assessment. This is a buzzword now, and we at Cambridge we're working on various concepts and themes that will fall into that approach of learning, and particularly in schools. In fact, we have a good number of research papers that are available on our website that would support, or that probably will shed more light on how gamification is used to increase learners' engagement. The second one is motivation. And I recall here an old theory that probably was presented many years ago of what's known as the expectation theory. And the expectation theory summarizes how we as learners, or as lifelong learners, increase our motivation. That's simply due to a result of two main variables: the value of what we're doing and the expectation associated with that value. So I know that basically doing a PhD will give me will give me a good career path, for example. But the expectation that this is going to be very difficult, very time-consuming, puts me off. And that's why I don't have a motivation at the end, a motivational force at the end that will push me to move forward. So you see what I mean? So the concept of motivation is very much proportionate to other variables. So obviously, in a context of a classroom, it could be an idea, it could be a theme, it could be a project that will increase that level of motivation. And finally, the third characteristic is developing that sense of critical thinking. Now, developing critical and creative thinking today is becoming really part of the 21st century skills that are needed for prospective employees. So if we are basically aiming to graduate a more more employable workforce, if you like, we have to think of focusing on creative thinking and developing critical thinking skills. So how all these characteristics will help us build a more effective structure in the classroom? As I said, the magic tool that I will use is assessment. So let's go to some reflections on our own practices in the classroom and try to develop it further into a framework that we can apply properly. Now, in our classes, I'm sure many of us use a range of tools, whether it's quizzes, exams, essays, reports, projects, whatever it is. We tend to, to diversify the methods and the topics and the types of assessments that we use. And we tend to do that for various reasons. We tend to do that because it creates a more valid kind of context to the assessment that we're throwing, to cover various areas that one assessment cannot necessarily cover, to develop more relevance to the 21st century curriculum, as we were saying earlier, by creating a more comprehensive learner that's not only knowledgeable, but also good thinker and a good social person. And also to create a more inclusive environment. One of the key challenges that I faced really as an educator and as a trainer and as a researcher is inclusion. And inclusion during COVID was a major challenge that I faced, that I witnessed in various institutions. And inclusion here refers to how can we make sure that learning is distributed equally, or everybody that basically we deliver learning to is given an equal chance of learning, i.e., kind of avoiding learning difficulties and major challenges related to certain issues related to learning disabilities. I am a specialized dyslexia expert, and one of the number of cases that I dealt with over the past year was astonishing. Many of them were not aware that they were dyslexic at all before they started online classes, which is quite amazing. We diversify sometimes because it helps increase motivation as well. We have that kind of love and hate relationship with exams. We tend to understand the importance of these exams, but when learners have an exam or an assessment that they have to prepare for, they tend to hate it. I know many learners perform much better when they're in the classroom context compared to, for example, their performance when they're taking an IELTS test. And it's not surprising really to us to hear from teachers that that their learners' level is much higher in the classroom compared to what they receive as an IELTS score. This is quite kind of understandable, and it's partially related to that kind of love and hate relationship that I just talked about. And there are various approaches to how we can decrease that. Of course, this is not the purpose of this exercise, but there are lots of ways where we can ensure that negative effect of summative assessment is minimized. Also, we diversify because of something that's not really less important than the previous ones, which is the workload, which is the marking workload. I used to teach at a number of institutions in the UK, and I remember those days where I used to have around 100 papers that I need to mark, 100 essays that I need to mark over the weekend. It's something I loathed as a teacher. I know how important it is, but at the end of the day, if I can diversify that approach, I can use technology, then obviously that will make my life much, much easier. And that will make me produce much better teaching content rather than focusing on a process that can be systemized, which is assessment. So there are various reasons, and I'm sure if you're asking yourself why you diversify, you will come up with your own reasons. These are some of the reasons that I came up with. And technically, before we embark on a practical approach to learning-oriented assessment and connecting all these different thoughts that I just mentioned, it's no secret to anybody that basically in our classrooms, it's not only one mechanism, it's not only one channel of learning that takes place. And us as teachers, we must make sure that we're capturing all these channels whereby learning takes place. I can think of a few, and I put this diagram and I use it in various contexts and various presentations simply for the sake of making sure that learning is a much more complicated process than we sometimes consider. In our work, we distinguish between two types of learning: the formal learning and the natural acquisition of knowledge. In the formal learning, it's obviously the textbook versus assessment channel. So there's a formal guideline, there's a formal process. But in order to achieve that process or to make that process a success, there's something that's not less important, which is the natural acquisition of knowledge. And I think that's something that many teachers around the world struggled with during COVID, during the lockdown. Because we kind of tend to learn from others. I tend to learn from my peers, my colleagues, from the social contexts of learning. And we miss that during learning. And it's not because we don't have the technology to support it. It's not because we don't have the expertise to do it. It's just simply because COVID caught us by surprise, really, at best, in many cases, in many situations. Only a few universities that we work with that were prepared for that kind of quick and almost immediate transformation into online learning over the past 2 years. And that's why that kind of natural acquisition element was, in most cases, missing. And that's why, I think one of the key things that probably we wanted to develop by promoting learning-oriented assessment is to ensure that that natural acquisition of knowledge is considered as part of learning. So the whole cycle then depends on the intersecting realms, really, from the personal world, from my own cognitive skills, to the group's skills, to my ability as well to mix and to merge within my classroom, and then the assessment construct and the assessment reference, of course, supported by the formal subjects, curriculum or content. So these four realms then form ultimately the journey of learning that we're calling for, and that only happens through these two channels that I just highlighted: the formal and the informal or the natural process. Now, for this to work well, I typically refer to my classroom box, which is now a catchphrase in various contexts. My classroom box is or represents how learning takes place at various levels. The red box represents the wider environment, the wider context, and that's typically referring to the national strategy or the national direction. Of course, the green one represents the institution, and inside the green box, that's where basically we play a major role as teachers and educators, where learning actually takes place. And that's most of the work that basically we do should be based on what happens within the blue and the purple boxes. Over the years, over the past 3 or 4 years at Cambridge, we tried to promote concepts related to supporting classroom research and supporting research that aims at improving practices in the classroom itself. And we, to a certain extent, succeeded. We have a number of research papers that I think you would be interested in going through, and I'll be more than happy to share the links for these papers or how we can improve our practice as researchers in our classrooms. How can we find out more of what our learners need as part of and use that to develop our own practice in the classroom? So that's what I was referring to ultimately, the traditional use of assessments into formative and summative now in this context is merged into one for one purpose, which is learning. So what I'm trying to say then now, why don't we improve? Why don't we standardize our formative assessment to be used as learning tools? For this to work, as I said, there are various approaches and various things. And I'm starting typically with the USEM model of learning. The USEM model is a contemporary model of increasing or developing more employable graduates from our schools. And this model technically combines various elements. And this diagram quite briefly shows these various skills and the intersection parts and the intersections between all these different skills. Moving from the personal qualities of the individual to the skills that are required, to the subject's knowledge and expertise, to the metacognition and the employability skills that are required in the market. So the ultimate end to the journey is employability skills. And employability skills here is very much related to what we started the conversation with, which is relevance. How can we make sure our classroom context is relevant to our learners to be able to transfer them effectively into a practical context? So with this model in mind, as I said, that includes 4 components that lead to the 5th. So 5 categories: the skills, the personal qualities, the knowledge, the metacognition leading to employability. How can we basically connect all these different dots to make our classrooms more oriented, learning oriented? I will ask you one question. At the end of your classroom, what do you say? How do you reflect on your learning at the end of your session, at the end of your day? again, a pause for thought here. You say to yourself that today what I taught was X, Y, Z, or you say today what my student learned was X, Y, Z. The answer to these two questions pretty much decides what approach you're taking. So the first one, today, what I taught was, is very neat, very professional, very straightforward. I prepare a lesson, I teach a lesson, I mark a lesson in the story. But if you're thinking it from a different perspective, today, what my student learned was, I have to think of the performance, I have to think of the observations that I took. I took notes while I was watching my students or waiting for my students to complete a task or an exercise. And I had a certain interpretation of these observations. They gave me a certain impression, and I fed back to the learners. So there are various things that I did. And a key component of that part was observation. A key component, a central component of that journey is observation, not assessment. So the difference between the traditional model and the model that we're calling for is a more involved, more of a personalized relationship of learning now between the teacher, who's now more of an observer, facilitator, compared to the traditional role of a teacher, marking papers and giving grades. But with that change, with that shift, there is a fundamental change as well in the responsibility. And that means when I'm observing something, I have to relate it, I have to link it to something else, either a previous performance or an assessment criteria or a statement or a course curricula, whatever it is, but there needs to be a proper point of reference that I observe against. And if I'm putting all these different ideas in context, then I will need to set clear objectives of what my classroom needs to achieve. And then I will monitor the performance and I'll observe that performance. I will interrupt the results. I will adjust the teaching cycle in order to feed into that setting up process right from the beginning. So what does that mean? That means I have a more systematic approach now. A more systematic approach to something that wasn't even systemized, to start with, which is what happens in the classroom. If my role was simply to plan a lesson, teach a lesson, mark a lesson, it was a clear, very neat process that ends in a grade or a score. Whereas here, my learning journey doesn't end in a score necessarily. It ends with a report. It ends with the conversations I'm having with the learner. I'm not undermining, of course, the importance of grades. I mean, we're living in globally, we're living in a result-oriented kind of landscape where results are very important to decide our progression. So I'm not saying that basically we are overlooking the importance of grades. What I'm saying is that we can increase performance in that kind of end product or summative assessment, whether it's IELTS or whatever exam that you've taken, simply by transforming what we do in the classroom systematically using this approach to learning-oriented assessment. And we published a large number of papers over the years that talks about learning-oriented assessment and the use of assessment as a learning mechanism in the classroom. And I will invite you really to take a look. I will share at the end of the presentation the various slides, the various links or titles to the papers that you will probably find very interesting going through them. So let's take in the last 10 minutes of the presentation, let me just give you a practical structure to how learning-oriented classroom would look like. We're just summarizing now everything we just said. So the starting point is a point of reference. A point of reference that would give us that clear criteria of what I would be observing my learners against. Lucky for us, in language learning, we've got the CEFR. Many people listening to me today, I'm sure, are familiar with what the CEFR stands for. It's a formal framework that provides clear descriptors to the skills that need to exist at each language level of proficiency. It starts from pre-A1, it goes all the way to C2. And there are various statements. We refer to them as can-do statements, statements whereby they summarize the learner's skills and the skills or what they can do at each level. As I said, it starts from pre-A1, it goes all the way to C2. Each one of them has a set of statements. Each one of these levels has a set of statements. And technically, these statements are what I would be using as my classroom objectives, as my curriculum objectives. And that's why technically we are calling for kind of a reflection on what takes place in the classroom. Now, I did a brief research using the HATSE 2009 criteria of measuring effectiveness of learning tools in the classroom. And we asked a group of teachers a range of questions. One of them was this one, to ask them to measure the impact of what they do in the classroom on the learner. We give them 6 statements: students taking frequent tests, teachers providing feedback to students, formative evaluation by teachers, teachers test preparation, teaching test preparation, students self-questioning, and finally teacher-student setting goals for learning. We asked learners, or we asked the respondents, the teachers, to rate the impact from 0 to 5. The sample was large enough to help us generalize the results. And again, the people listening to me today, please feel free to rate them according to your own criteria. How would you rate these statements according to the importance or their most powerful impact on learners? I'll give you 1 minute just to think of how you'd rate them yourself. Right. So many people would give various responses, but obviously statistically, if we gather the responses from everybody doing this exercise today, we will end up with something like this. A lot of teachers agree that probably one of the most important actions that we do in the classroom is providing formative evaluation to our teachers. Give them corrections and helping them correct their mistakes as they go. And then with that, of course, comes the skill of providing feedback. And then giving the students the opportunity to reflect and self-question. And then, of course, working together with the students on putting a plan, a development plan. And of course, reinforcing that with frequent quizzes and tests, and preparing for these tests comes the least impactful. We found that this piece of research was amazing for various reasons. But to me, the key reason, it shows the importance of assessment tools used in the classroom and the power of feedback. Feedback can be negative and positive at the same time. Positive because, of course, it gives us the correction and the guidance that we need. But positive because, but negative sometimes because feedback is a weapon that, if not used properly, it will really give me negative results. Carol Dweck in 2006 produced a very interesting piece of research where she explored the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset development among school children using the power of feedback. And I will invite everybody to explore it further in a quick Google search. You'll find plenty of details related to Carol Dweck's fixed mindset theory or research. So that brings me back to now a structure that I will put around learning-oriented assessment. So with all these concepts hopefully cleared, we've got clear objectives, performance, observations, interpretations, and adjustments of the teaching cycle. In order to put this together, as I said, we will be starting with the Common European Framework as our starting point. With that, we've got clear objectives. These clear objectives will shape up the course or the curriculum that basically, hopefully, will depend. So obviously, I can't just go and apply learning-oriented assessment at any point. I have to think of the objectives, and I have to link it with the classroom and the school's overall learning outcomes. So it's a systematic process that requires some planning for. Now, the ultimate idea is to use each objective as a task. You see, so the starting point here is an exercise or an assessment, not a learning theory, not knowledge, because we said, based on the theoretical foundation we started with, it's typically the task that will give us that kind of involvement that we called for according to David Kolb's theory of exponential learning. So if I'm starting learning with a task, so for a B2 students, for example, I would ask them to prepare a presentation on any topic, that I can think of. And I will invite them to use X, Y, Z, the statements or the can-do statements or the learning outcomes that I wanted them to cover. And I give the tasks to the learners in a group. I observe the learners through my observation mechanism. I record my observations and I provide feedback. This cycle, although sounds very simple, but it is quite challenging. It's quite challenging because I have to understand now, not only of the knowledge that I'm passing, but also thinking of the various 4 realms that we talked about at the beginning. I have to understand my learners' differences now. I have to make sure that whatever barriers that I work on are removed. And if I repeat this cycle now multiple times for all the objectives in a level, I would be able to produce a record of achievement. Now that record of achievement then eventually gives me a more comprehensive overview of the level of the learner, a more accurate assessment of that learner in terms of his English or her English language proficiency. So if we're repeating that cycle multiple times, we'll end up in a situation where we have various collections. So the challenge that we face is how can we store all this data? And of course, technology never fails us. And it's astonishing, really, when we know the amount of technology that's available really at our fingertips. We at Cambridge provide a set of tools and resources that you will find very, very useful if you are aiming to adopt a learning-oriented approach. One of them is the digital teacher, and I invite everybody really to have a look at the digital teacher platform, thedigitalteacher.com. It gives you an overview for all the apps that probably we are involved in. It provides you as well with free lesson plans, or particularly learning-oriented lesson plans, and most importantly, it tests your digital skills. It gives you the training that you need in the digital context. And, this model is really kind of typical of what the future is going to hold for us. I can envision that basically learning would be more on demand. So smaller nuggets of value here and there. That's all what we need. I don't have the time really to go through a 500-page book to understand how learning-oriented assessment works. I need a brief presentation or a brief overview in a quick summary in 5 minutes, and then I will do my thinking. I will just simply do my own development for that kind of purpose. Another important element related to all of this is what is the right tool that can be used in the classroom in a context that will lead to a learning-oriented classroom. In Cambridge, we worked on various products. In this acquaintance, I'm happy to share certain brief details related to one of our key tests called LinguaSkill. LinguaSkill is a test that's modular, that combines, that's divided into 2 or 3 main categories, learning and reading, listening and reading. That's the first category, and the writing section and the speaking part. The typical way of the current research that I'm conducting at the moment is to use linguaskill as the mechanism for a learning-oriented structure. How? The easiest way to do it, really, is to break down linguaskill modularly. Linguaskill is a modular test. So I can take the listening and reading part separate. I can take the writing part separate. I can take the speaking part separate. So one of the papers that I worked on over the past few months, really, is breaking that modularity in a classroom context and building it in the classroom itself. So what I typically did with the university that I worked with is I started with a listening and reading assessment as a starting point, and I measured where the students, I observed their performance, their reactions, their behavior, their exam anxiety, etc., all these different factors, and the impact on their motivations on learning. And we realized, of course, that adopting that model carries a very significant impact on learners' performance overall. So obviously, the skills that linguaskill covers are 4: listening and reading, writing and speaking. For listening and reading, they incorporate as well the use of language, the grammar, as part of the context, and it provides in-depth reporting that's aligned to the CFR. I think we're running out of time, so I'm not sure how well I'm doing with time. So I'll breeze through this very quickly, just to mention properly some of the other tools that you can incorporate in the learning-oriented context is the Speak and Improve and Write and Improve apps. Write and Improve is a very powerful tool that gives more independence to learners when it comes to improving writing skills. Speak and Improve is a similar app, provides that functionality quite well. So for me to summarize at the end all the key objectives then of this exercise, we are calling for a new approach to learning, a new approach to learning that utilizes assessment as a learning mechanism. And that requires 5 main components: record keeping, providing effective feedback, blended learning, and increasing ownership of learning, and of course, ultimately increasing motivation. For this to work, we've got 3 main components that work hand in hand: assessment, technology, and learning. And as I said before, there are various papers that we publish that highlight how LOA works. These are some of the papers that are available on our website on studies in English language testing. If you can't source out these papers, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be more than happy to send them to you. My contact details appear on the screen, but if you also reach out to the organizers, I'm sure they will put you in touch with us. That brings me to the end of my presentation, which I really hope that you enjoyed it. I really hope that the ideas that were presented are useful, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on how you applied learning-oriented assessment or how you're using linguaskill in your classroom. That's the end from my side today. Thank you very much again for having me today. I'm not sure if we have time for questions, but I'll pass it back to the organizers for their advice. Makoton, back to you.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. Do you have any questions to Professor Saghbani from the audience? Yeah. Okay, we have a question. Can you please come closer to the microphone and speak? Where is the microphone? Come closer. Speak.
Oh, hi. I got a question, but you previously mentioned that tasks about that assesses the 21st century curriculum. Could you please give more details? What did you mean by that? Like 21st century curriculum?
Thank you very much for the question. At the beginning, or a couple of years back, we were asked a similar question. And that ignited a lot of thinking in our end at Cambridge. And now, if you look to if you go to the digital teacher, you'll find a complete framework that looks at the 21st century skills that are required in language teaching. The ultimate change, really, in my book, and as you will be able to see it in the framework, in the English language teaching competency framework that we published, is the change in thinking. Today, our learners tend to think or to use technology more often. This is a fact. Today, our learners tend to use social media more often. They have more skills that are required in the marketplace than the skills that probably were needed 20 or 30 or even 10 years ago. There are new changes to that mindset. So one of the fundamental changes in the 21st century curriculum is the promotion of creative and critical thinking. And any of the questions that you will see in our assessments, you will find that critical thinking and creative thinking is assessed through these questions. Lingual skill, for example, the design of the questions, the design of the tests themselves incorporate critical thinking, particularly in the reading part and the listening to a certain extent, but in the reading section, you see it more clearly. So for me, one of the most immediate changes in the 21st century skills is creative and critical thinking.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Professor.
Thank you.
After 10 minutes, we'll start our panel discussion with experts. Then you can ask questions. They will make discussions about problems that we experience. Greg will join us. Penny, all of experts who participate in our conference will join the panel discussion. And if you have any questions that you can raise, and all of them will be able to answer questions. Now, 10 minutes short break for coffee and for snacks. Enjoy your time.
Thank you.